Good evening. Sorry for the delay. I was listening to Joe reminisce about the Pentagon Papers and Watergate, and you realize you can get lost. And he's got some great stories, and which I'm sure he'll be more than willing to share when we get to that part of the program. Good evening. I'm Bradley Graham. I'm the co-owner of the bookstore along with my wife Lissa Muscatine, and on behalf of everybody here at P&P, thank you very much for coming. We're really delighted to have Joe Califano with us this evening. Joe, of course, over many decades has had accomplished runs in both government and in practicing law. No doubt he's very familiar already to many of you, but just to touch on a few highlights of his life. His government service began in the early 1960s as a special assistant at the Pentagon under President Kennedy and Robert McNamara. Under President Johnson, he served as the White House. Served at the White House as the chief assistant for domestic affairs, and President Carter in the late 1970s made him Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. As a Washington lawyer, Joe represented the Washington Post during the Watergate affair, counseled the Democratic National Committee, and served, what today is called the House Ethics Committee. He also has represented clients as varied as Coca-Cola and the Black Panther Party. In the early 1990s, he founded the National Center on Addiction and Substance Abuse at Columbia University and headed this research organization for 20 years. He's also the author of more than a dozen other books on a wide range of subjects. His latest work, Our Damaged Democracy, carries a very, what is for him a very deeply felt and an urgent message. For as he says in the book's introduction, never has he been so concerned about America's future. He delivers a blunt and comprehensive critique about just how dysfunctional our government has become, along with some advice about what we can and should do about it. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Joe Califano.
Thank you. I should tell you that when I worked for President Johnson, one of my jobs was to supervise speechwriters in connection on anything domestic. And one of those speechwriters was Peter Benchley, and I fired him because I told him he didn't know how to write, and what I'd give for a smidgen of the royalties he got when he wrote Jaws. But in any case, LBJ used to make, like any president, a lot of talks to the pages, to the trucking groups, to the, I don't know if we ever talked to the NRA, because we literally proposed licensing of every gun owner and registration of every gun, and which would be unthinkable today to try and think about it. But Johnson would have all these little, small groups, and these talks were on index cards, yellow index cards about this big, and big, bold type, big print. And he never looked at them before he went in. And the morning after, I talked to Peter Benchley, and I would start every day by looking at the Mac Bundy or Walt Rostow looked at the cards if they involved foreign policy. I'd look at anything on domestic policy or anything else. And the day after I talked to Peter Benchley, I went in, the cards were on, stack of cards were on my desk, and the top card said, they say you can't increase defense spending and balance the budget. Well, I say you can, and I'm going to tell you how. They say you can't rebuild the cities of America with no increase in taxes. Well, I say you can, and I'm going to tell you how. And they say you can't reduce unemployment to 3% with no danger of inflation. Well, I say you can, and I'm going to tell you how. And I picked up that top card, and the next one said, okay, Lyndon, you're on your own. True story. I want to talk a little bit. I wrote this book because I think this may be relatively sophisticated. I'm sure it's a sophisticated audience, but most of the people in this country really don't quite, I think, appreciate the systemic depth of the problems we have, and not attributable to any one president or any one court or any one Congress, but they are serious. And it's not, it's not a Donald Trump problem. The presidency is a colossal amount of power now in the American presidency. It's accumulated over 50 years. You think about this. The last declaration of war was in 1941, when Roosevelt made that dramatic presentation to Congress. Presidents have sent millions of Americans into combat. 1 million have been wounded. 100,000 have been killed. And there's been no declaration of war. None. Congress has just ceded that power to the president. And it's all presidents. Have no illusions. What Reagan did, what Clinton did, what Bush did, what Bush II did, what Obama did. Incredible. And the power to legislate. It's the first president to do this was, I think, Ronald Reagan. He signed a bill into law. It was an environmental bill, and he said, signing this into law, but I'm not following these couple of sections. Every president since that has repeatedly done that while in office, and Congress has done nothing. And the White House staff, the size of the White House staff was about 50 when I was in the government. That's the 1960s, and that's what it was under Kennedy and under Eisenhower when I was in the White House. The size of the White House staff today approaches 2,000. Now think about this. The National Security Council is now about 450 people. So if you're Tillerson, you're probably happy to get out from under them. I mean, the State Department has very little to do with formulating foreign policy. And that's been true. I mean, you remember in the Obama years, Gates quit because Rhodes negotiated, White House aide negotiated with Cuba. John Kerry knew nothing about it till it was announced. Common. It's happening all the time. I mentioned the domestic policy staff. The communications department. We have basically a state-run media in the United States today. You have whitehouse.gov. You have the internet, interactive, the internet. You have YouTube, White House, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. There's no organization like that. Most of that explosion occurred with the technology change that President Obama took advantage of, and Trump has, of course, added tweeting to that. And I mentioned the White House counsel's office because it's a wonderful example of what happens when the staff is engaged. George W. Bush, remember the issue of were we torturing prisoners or not torturing prisoners? What was it? And then the Justice Department initially said they were torturing prisoners, and then the White House counsel said, no, it's not, and put pressure on, and eventually there was an opinion on that. When President Obama went into Libya, he asked Eric Holder, his Attorney General, he said, are these hostilities that I have to either report to Congress or bring the troops back? And Holder said, yes, they are. So he went to his White House counsel, who said, no, they're not. And he followed his White House counsel. That's just the reality of what a large staff can do. Congress is crippled. It's crippled for a lot of reasons, and it is not doing its job. I mentioned here the gerrymander. Of course, we have gerrymandering all over the country. We have two cases, one from Maryland and one from Wisconsin, and I think one from Texas headed up to the Supreme Court. But if you're sure the Republican's going to win when you carve the right district, or you're sure the Democrats are going to win when you carve the right district, then the election is the primary. The general election is a foregone conclusion. And very small numbers of people run in vote in primaries. But something even more insidious happens. The Democrats are pushed to the left, the Republicans to the right. To win the primary, they make all kinds of commitments. Then they come to Washington, and they don't compromise. They literally don't compromise. They've turned compromise into a four-letter word. And then fundraising. There is in this book, I think money is really the root of most political evil in this country. There's an appendix to this book from 2013, every Democrat in Congress, and what he or she was assigned to have to raise for the campaign committees of the House. It's quite remarkable. And if you want to be chair of a committee, you have to pay dues. And the dues you pay, if it's a big committee, like the Appropriations Committee or the Ways and Means Committee, it's $500,000 if you're a Democrat, if you want to chair the committee. If you're a Republican, it's $800,000. But the fact is, you have to spend time to raise money. And what kind of time are we talking about? Well, think about this. And that's just for the campaign committees. In 2016, the average senator running for re-election, incumbent senator, had to raise $30,000 a week every week of the 6-year term in order to have the campaign funds needed. And in the House, it was $15,000 a week every week of the term. And we've had, we really, and Congress doesn't, I mentioned, presidents declare war. Congress doesn't want to get involved. 98% of the executive agreements since World War II have been, of the foreign agreements, have been executive agreements. And Congress is happy to not have to get involved. And all you do is think about the Iran nuclear deal. The Democrats pretzel themselves, and the Republicans, so as to avoid any record vote either for or against the Iranian deal. They just don't want to face the courts. Our courts have become politicized in many ways. You think about this, more than 50 Supreme Court decisions since 2010. The courts have split 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, and Anthony Kennedy in the middle. And if you go to the lower courts, well, if you want to blow out Obama's immigration plan, you go to the Eastern District of Texas, and the federal judge there issued a nationwide injunction. It's the end of Obama's plan. If you want to blow out President Trump's plan, you go to San Francisco, and you go to the federal district court there, and the federal district judge issues a nationwide injunction and ends the plan. I think this kind of conduct, the esteem in which the Supreme Court is held, it had about a 65% approval rating, and over the last 10 or 15 years, it's down around 40%. This is just a quickie, but it's important to understand 35 states now get at least 30% of their revenue from the federal government. And, in life, there's no free lunch. In politics, there are no free crumbs. So with those funds come strings, mandates, and lots of them. And think about this. If you happen to be in a state where the state constitution requires you to balance your budget, what are your choices? You can raise taxes, you can reduce programs, or you can go to the White House or the Congress on bended knee and beg for money and not have to do either of those other unpleasant things. When you get the money, there are price tags attached to it. Just a snapshot of the financial problem. When you think of 16 people donated $500 million to super PACs in the last election cycle. And the world of single issues, we have, and it's one of the things that fragments our society. We have, billionaires across the board. It can be the Koch brothers on the right or Soros on the left, a whole army of them. Think about it. Are you either pro-life or pro-choice. You're excuse me, pro-gun control or anti-gun control. You stay with that, says somebody who, you stay with my position on pro-choice. You stay with my position against gun control. Whatever else you do, I'll give you millions of dollars. I'll give you enough money to run for president. Remember, what's his name? Sherwin Adelson, the Nevada guy, gave Newt Gingrich $5 million a weekend before he was going to be run out of the race in Georgia to get through it. I mean, this kind of money. Why? I mean, the Supreme Court, many years before the Citizens United case, in a case called Buckley v. Vallejo, started to give money, First Amendment rights, and since then it's been smothering public policy. Just to remind people what it's like, 71% of the presidential campaign ad spending in this last campaign was in 4 states. 95% of the presidential campaign trips, both sides, were in 14 states. And 90% of all the money spent was in 14 states on the presidential campaign. There are fault lines that make governing much more difficult. The media, we do have a mirror media. I mean, you don't have to listen to anything on television you don't like. You can listen to Fox News on the far right. You can listen to MSNBC on the far left. You can listen to CNN on the left. You don't have to hear any adverse things. And remember, Pat Moynihan used to say, you're entitled to your own opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts. Well, now in America, you can have your own facts. Pick your channel, and you'll get the facts you want. So we don't have, Bob Schieffer has a wonderful book on this subject. We don't have a common set of facts we're dealing with. It's just a serious problem. The partisanship is incredible. A lot of you experience it, I'm sure. It's just, and to me, the most telling example of it is in the House Intelligence Committee. You have Nunes, who writes, and Schiff don't talk to each other. So Nunes writes a memo, he gives it to the president, the FBI okays it, and then the president says, okay, I've cleaned it up, and puts it out. Then Schiff answers by writing another memo, he sends it to the president, he goes to the FBI. I mean, think about this. They're building a wall, a physical wall between the Republican staff and the Democratic staff on the House Intelligence Committee. Now think about it. If you're Putin, think about this. The Intelligence Committee of the United States House of Representatives, the Congress, and they don't talk to each other? Wow, what a setup for me. I've got a great deal. I can really deal with this. And it's tragic. The parties, we're having a serious fault line with respect to race in this country. We all know that, but just to give you a sense, at the Democratic Convention, 50% of the delegates were white, 25% were African American, about 15% were Latino. Look at the Republicans. 94% white, less than 1% African American, and about 5% Latino. The other thing that's important to recognize is Lyndon Johnson, 1964, was the last Democratic president to have a majority of the white vote. The Democrats now have to struggle to get somewhere between 35 and 40%, 41% of the white vote. Most Democrats have gotten over 90% of the African-American vote, those that have won. Hillary, who couldn't either turn out African-Americans or she only got 88%, lost the election. I think there's a reality here that the Democrats and the Republicans both have to face over time. My view, after looking at all the data we looked at for this book, is that I don't think the Democrats can win a national election without at least 90% of the African-American vote. And that's not healthy for this country, to have heading towards one white party and one Black and Brown Party. Education inequality, there are all kinds of measures of it, but this was so striking to me. You think about this. In 1970, 40% of the highest income quartile in this country got bachelor's degrees. In 2010, it's 80%, doubled. The highest quartile got bachelor's degrees. But in the lowest income quartile, it went from 6% in 1970 to 8% in 2010. That spells trouble. And the other thing I'd mention about this is go to public education. Part of education says 40% of high school seniors in American schools cannot do basic math, and they cannot really do basic English. Now think about the danger that presents to our country, where we have the brightest madmen in the world writing ads, the stickers on the bumper stickers, and of course the tweets. I just put this on because I ask all of you to think when you go home. Every one of these things feeds on another. The presidency, the politicizing of the court. Think about it. There was a day when you'd say, okay, well, Bill Brennan could get almost unanimous support. Scalia got unanimous support when he was nominated. They were both regarded. They were liberal and conservative, but they were regarded as great minds. Now, the deciding factor, the president first, we don't appoint politicians anymore like Earl Warren. We don't. But remember, Warren gave us some of the greatest decisions ever, including the one person, one vote decision. But now we appoint appellate judges. One of the main reasons, because presidents know exactly where those people stand. You have no doubt about where the nominee stands. He's written about it. You've read his view on abortion or choice. You've read his view on religious liberty. You've read his view on what he thinks of the Second Amendment and whether it provides individual rights. And what happens? The president then nominates that person, and we go through theater. It's like political theater. The Senate Judiciary Committee acts as though they don't know his or her views. They know all about their views. They've read all the opinions. Their staffs agree with them. And the issue is whether the last test, can this candidate for the court walk over those hot coals and get in? That's not the way we should be picking justices, but it shows what's happened here. I've covered the other things. There are things you can do. To me, the most important thing is for people to get out and vote in primaries and select people. Whatever you think, and if you live in New York, you have enormous disappointment with both the candidates. You can talk to somebody who, oh my God, how do we get this woman who seemed a little entitled and really didn't have a vision, and this guy that was an egomaniac? How do we get them as our choices? And well, the answer is Hillary Clinton got the Democratic nomination with 8% of the registered Democrats. Donald Trump got the Republican nomination with 7% of the registered Republicans. That's how we got there. So you have to get out there. And in the primaries, in terms of congressional voting and senators and what have you, that's where it's all going to be decided. I mentioned the influence of money. I think the Supreme Court has to basically reverse itself on that decision. I think there now is enough material out there for good lawyers to get the right case and demonstrate the damage that money has done in terms of stamping down public policy and in terms of corruption of our Congress and our whole system. We need to, and somebody said, there's a limit. You can only give $2,700 each, so a couple can only give $5,400. That's nonsense. How does George Clooney give $500,000 to Hillary, and how do the Koch brothers give $500,000 to Trump? Very, very simple. You can give $10,000 to each state party, and the state parties can transfer that money to the presidential candidate. So there are no limits. There are really no limits on what people can give. And that forget about, and I love, you know what dark money is? There's a whole book on it now, but there are ways you can give money and nobody can trace it back to you that you gave it, okay? I love, you can read, in Citizens United, there's a wonderful paragraph by Justice Kennedy in which he says, now with new technology, people can't hide what they're giving. Everybody knows. Well, nonsense. They don't know. And I would note, I do think technology can do one thing. We certainly could require that every candidate put online immediately every dollar they receive or every commitment they get. Congress has got to go back to work. They are not doing their job. I mean, I mentioned this about Congress, plus the fact that, as we all know, they're here about 3 days a week. And they say, well, they go home to their district. Well, some of them go home to their district. But what's more important to a congressman than his district, in terms of raising the money to run in his district, is the committees he's on, the subcommittees he's on. And where do they go? I live in New York. They're up every weekend. We got a bunch of congressmen and senators, or Los Angeles, or Chicago, or Atlanta, or Dallas, or Houston. Washington, D.C. doesn't give that much money to these guys. Maybe you're smarter. And that's it. I'm happy to be here because you people are close to this, you care about it, and I think people who do care have got to make sure their friends and their kids really understand how important getting involved in the process is. We've had some stunning examples of it, and I just would, I'd close, if I could, with everybody. Every author likes to read what he writes. Really makes you feel good. This is the end of the book. Trust is critical. Change is enormously difficult to master under any circumstances, but brutally so when we have lost trust in our institutions. Our presidents, our legislators, our courts, our media, our political opponents, our fellow citizens of different ethnic, racial, and religious backgrounds. Trust is possible in our complex society only with strong, honest leadership of high competence and compassion that encourages citizens to shake hands, not form fists. Reliable, consistent policies that are fairly applied must be seen as fairly applied. And political fairness, like justice, must not only be delivered, but must also be perceived as having been delivered. That is not possible in a mightily partisan, single-issue political culture in which the size of the bankroll smothers the soundness of the policy and the lock gates of a gerrymander gut the value of votes. We have lots to do, a long, hard journey ahead. So did Christopher Columbus, the founding fathers Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr., and Susan B. Anthony. They had successes and failures, and so will we. But each of us has to get involved. This is no time to sit back and leave it to the other gal or guy. Or to fear failure. It is a time for all of us to speak up and exhibit and demand of our leaders the courage to take some risks and persevere until we repair our damaged democracy. It would be a tragedy for our children if we let the damage persist, increase, fracture, and petrify our society. We will make mistakes, some colossal ones. We will take plenty of missteps, and we will trip and fall along the way. So what? Wouldn't we, the people, rather make mistakes than have our children and grandchildren say that we didn't even try. That's why I wrote this book. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your interesting discussion. I can't wait to read your book. First of all, I want to say thank you for your years of service. I can't think of too many people who have had a greater impact in your whole life. My question is really about your work in addiction. Could you give us kind of a report card on where we've come treating and understanding addiction and where we need to go forward?
Well, sure. I mean, I can. I think we have come to the point where we realize that addiction is a disease. Maybe it's self-inflicted in a sense, but it's a disease. I think we have come a long way, and we've learned that there are no boundaries. You know, heroin was a black problem. Let's all remember that. I remember we proposed in the Johnson years in 1966, we got it passed, the first drug rehabilitation law. We asked for $15 million. We thought the bill might grow to maybe $50 million. It's almost $3 billion today that the federal government is spending on that. And our difficulty in passing the bill was, this is Lyndon Johnson, this is another Negro bill. The reality is that we've seen that opioids are everywhere. And in New York City, where I live, there's a strip of Staten Island, St. Clair's Parish. It's actually the largest Catholic parish, I think, in the United States. All police, firemen, and garbage men, all on the books, as the expression goes there. I mean, they're all working. And a lot of them have gotten OxyContin because they've been shot, because they've broken their back, because accident, burned, or what have you. The greatest increase in opioid increase now from addiction in the last few years has been in that parish. And why? Parents leave the pills on the medicine cabinet. We did surveys in our work at Columbia, and a third of teenagers say that they got their first opioid, their first high, from their parents' medicine cabinet, their pills. OxyContin, Vicodin, what have you, Percocet. A third say they got them from their friends who got them. So we estimate that at least half the kids who start are getting what their parents left in their medicine cabinet, and that's terrible. We have to change. We don't. And the last thing I'd say is that we spend billions of dollars on cancer and heart research. We spend very little on research for drug and alcohol treatment, and we have to come to that. And NIH has to come to that. And lastly, everybody has their troubles with the chaos in the administration. But if you stop and think about it, the federal government has enormous power to do something about this, because if you look at the OxyContin, at the heroin problem, it starts with the research. It starts with the pharmaceutical companies. Then the FDA has to approve the drugs. They could have much tougher requirements on making them harder to abuse. Then the doctors and the nurses have to be trained to not pour this stuff out the way they've been pouring it out, and we have to get, the schools, the kids have to be educated. I remember it was so controversial to provide any sex education in the schools years ago. We had virtually no education of our children, even to this day in the schools, about addiction and about the relationship between getting hooked on tobacco and hooked on alcohol and smoking marijuana and then moving to other substances. We were with Bill Bratton. Most gunshot deaths occur by suicide, overwhelmingly by suicide, or accidents. They're almost invariably among people that know each other. He thought marijuana was responsible for more gunshot deaths in New York City when he was commissioner than any other substance, because he said people would get high and then they'd have a sinker and whatever. Yes.
Mr. Secretary, I don't know if it's still playing, but last week I saw a play at the Arena Stage called The Great Society. So if it's still playing, you might be interested in seeing it. But my question has to do with the Hastert Rule, because I looked quickly in your index and I didn't see you mention it there. But it seems to me one of the barriers to compromise, besides gerrymandering and candidates running to the left or the right, and besides money, is the Hastert Rule in the House. Of course, the flip side of that is the gradual erosion of the filibuster in the Senate. But I read an interesting op-ed last year by a member of Congress who I think was a Republican when Tip O'Neill was Speaker, and he said Tip O'Neill was really the last Speaker of the House because he would let the minority party propose a bill, and if they could get enough support from the majority party, then you'd have a compromise where people would kind of meet in the middle. And that rule was imposed initially by Dennis Hastert, but Nancy Pelosi followed it when she was Speaker, and it seems to be a barrier to compromise on the House side. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that and or the filibuster.
Sure. I mean, I think the problem in the House is that rule. The fact that we have that and the fact that we don't deal with it that is because the partisanship is so severe. I mean, I really do think that's a problem. I think that I don't think there's much conversation between Speaker Ryan and Nancy Pelosi, or Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer. I mean, and that really affects every. When I went to the first week I went to work for Lyndon Johnson, which is 1960. Pardon me? Oh, the first week I went to work for Lyndon Johnson, he said, "You remember something? You treat Jerry Ford, who was the minority leader in the House, the same way you treat Speaker McCormick, and you treat Everett Dirksen the same way you treat the majority leader, Mike Mansfield." And we did. Did they need a job for a constituent? Did they need something? We did. That's unheard of. I think it really ended for good with the tear between Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich, but I'm really not sure. So I think the problem just fundamentally it affects our whole society, and as far as the Great Society goes, I will tell you that the predecessor play, the Johnson play that Robert Schenken wrote, All the Way. Schenken told me that the greatest thing he had in terms of creating that play and that character was another book I wrote called The Triumph and Tragedy of Lyndon Johnson. So I urge you to get it, as well as this book. I don't know if they have it here. It was republished a few years ago. I think it was originally published in 91. What? That was a setup. Yes.
In terms of democracy in this country, realistically, to me, ever since the Ku Klux Klan started suppressing black votes, I haven't really thought democracy worked as well as it should. Do you see democracy working worse today than it did, say, 30 years ago? Is this a dramatically worse situation? Or is it just a same problem represented with different symptoms?
I think democracy is not easy. In the years I'm most familiar with, we certainly, in the Johnson years, we had total opposition from the Southern Democrats and the Southern House members who controlled all the committees. But we were able to put enough Republicans and Democrats together to get those bills passed. I think there was something else which is just harder. We also, we would say, "Oh, you can't do this on Medicare. You can't. You're giving in to the doctors." And the president would say, or he said, or the hospitals, he'd say, this is an incredibly complex bill. It has to be operated by the professionals and the states. Medicaid was a state program. If we don't have half the Republicans with us, it's going to be a hell of a problem to get the bill implemented, okay? We were able to do that. Now, Obama, both because he just didn't have that opportunity and because he wasn't made that way, I think both, didn't have that chance with Obamacare. So in that sense, sure, it's harder. And I think the partisanship is rawer, R-A-W-E-R, than it was. But I think, look, I am confident that every time the American people understand the problem, okay, they figure out a way to deal with it. And one of the reasons I did this book is because I don't think most people really understand that it isn't any one president, it isn't any one court, it isn't any one Congress. This has just been building for 50 years. And we've just watched the Congress cede its power. We've watched the presidents, of course. You know, both sides. Every president, you stop and think about, George W. Bush, or H.W. Bush said, we are not going to have executive orders. We're not going to let executive orders be poured out of here the way Clinton did. We're going to go by the law, okay? Of course, they issued executive orders galore. Then Obama said, we're not going to have any of George W. Bush. It's a disgrace. The executive order is what he's done by executive order. And of course, Obama issued, got so frustrated with Congress, just poured out executive orders. And then we have Trump saying Obama's executive orders are a disgrace. This is not a disaster, was his word. This is not the way you run the country. And the first year in office, Trump issued more executive orders than any president in the history of the country. So let's be real about what's happening here. Just go ahead.
Yeah, I wonder if we can return to the subject of addiction here just briefly. I'm wondering what you feel the influence of partisanship is now on the contemporary addiction problem in comparison to whether partisanship was or how much partisanship was the problem back with heroin or with addiction in decades past. Has the problem of partisanship as an obstacle to solving the problem of addiction gotten worse or gotten better? Or what do you think?
I think partisanship has probably created problems on almost every issue. I think we tend to think of some of these issues as Republican or Democrat. Remember when?
Right.
With Johnson, we were constantly afraid that people would think we were not anti-communist enough. We were not anti-Russia enough. We don't have to worry about the Democrats anymore. Now we have to worry about the Republicans. I think partisanship affects every one of those issues because we turn them into partisan issues. My God, as one of the fathers said, if you can't do anything else right away, the one thing you can do is make schools safer. That's not a big deal. You can't go into any building in New York City of any size without a security check, or a ID. There are some simple things but we can't even seem to get that. And I think that's unfortunate. But yes, I think it's made it worse, much worse. And we didn't have, just to go back to it, this is, the day after Johnson's landslide in '64, there's a wonderful phone conversation. If you ever get a chance to, you can. They're available online, in which Everett Dirksen calls President Johnson to congratulate him. And Johnson says, Everett Dirksen, the minority leader, he said, Everett, I wouldn't want to be here if you weren't here. And he said, well, Mr. President, I'm calling because I'm going to have an operation, and I don't want to schedule it if you're going to have a leadership meeting. We should have a lot of joint leadership meetings. And Everett said, Everett, where are you going to be operating on? He said, Walter Reed. And the president said, isn't that wonderful, Everett? You and I, we get all this medical care. You know, we can do that for everybody over 65 if you come with me on my Medicare bill. And Everett's kind of, I wish I could imitate the voices. He hesitates and chokes, and then Johnson says, and you know, Everett, I'm going to be coming up next year with a Voting Rights Act. Oh, Mr. President, I can't be any part of that. Well, Everett, I really need you on this voting rights. He said, oh, Mr. President. He said, Everett, you got it. And Everett keeps saying, no. He said, Everett, listen to me. You come with me on the Voting Rights Act to break that filibuster. And 100 years from now, there'll only be two people from Illinois anyone will remember, Abraham Lincoln and Everett Dirksen. We don't have that anymore.
Right.
You know, we don't have that. Yes.
Thank you very much for a detailed analysis of what is wrong with American democracy, how it works. Now, the subtitle of your book is "What the People, We the People Can Act." Could you give us some detail and what can and should be done, and in particular, what could be done to break this tremendous polarization on almost any issue?
Well, I think one thing we have to do, people have to vote in primaries and earlier and get engaged. There's no question about that. No, it's not enough. I think another thing we have to do that I really think is critical now, we must educate our young people. We can't have a significant segment of the population. Think about that number, 40% of high school seniors not doing basic math, not really grasping basic English. They're clay pigeons for demagogues. I think that's a critical thing to do. That's every community. You know, that's not the feds. It is federal money, but that's really, you know, as I learned when I was a kid in Brooklyn, if you want to get teachers to teach more and better, and you want to get schools better, it's parents. Parents have to go fight for the right to get their kids educated, and that is a very critical thing. And it's not something, you know, it's not like, oh, there are a bunch of schools in a ghetto in New York City. The schools in rural America most of them are terrible. Public schools, elementary and secondary schools. We have to deal with that. I think we have to raise hell about what money is doing. I think we have to the Supreme Court reads newspapers. They really do read newspapers. If you have any doubt about that, think about what President Obama did with the Affordable Care Act. When that was before the Supreme Court, he spoke and he spoke and he spoke about what Americans were getting from it. And believe me, I can't get inside his head, but I have no question but that had an impact on Chief Justice Roberts when he came up with that tortured tax. So we got to shout. You know, we got to shout. There are a lot of other lesser things. There are things in this book that are important. And your congressman, I mean, we need. I know it, but I mean, you know, we have to have better leaders. And, you know, we got to look in the mirror. You know, every time somebody says, well, I got such a lousy senator or my congressman, well, look in the mirror. What did you do to get a better leader? We'll see. Yes. One, go ahead.
Hi. I've followed quite a bit of your work over the years, particularly your work on addiction. But I just want to push back a little bit on your recommendation that we have to get involved, and I do it in this way, that those of us that have been looking at decision making as studying decision making, we're finding that it is that critical thinking in the most educated sectors of the economy is really marginal. Because in part, as the partisanship, and two, the audience rating systems that are used to develop news and so I was wondering what you think of that. That I mean.
Well, let me tell you, I think you're right on some of this. One, I really do. I mean, my own view is that on the cable news side, all three of the channels really look at viewers as customers,
Yes.
not as citizens
No.
anymore. There is no Walter Cronkite. I mean, we just don't have people like that. And
It's a market. They see people as markets.
Absolutely. It's ratings. It's money.
I worked in an advertising, so I worked
Okay,
with
well,
this.
you know, but I mean, I think that's really very important. I also think there's some discussion of this in the book. I think we have to recognize that the people we may support, we may have voted for, we have to hold them to some standard. We can't just be knee-jerk for Trump or knee-jerk for Hillary Clinton or knee-jerk for Obama or a knee-jerk for a Bush. We really, the people we support, we should demand higher standards of. We need, and I also think we need to take more risks.
Yes, exactly.
This is another Johnson example, but I'll never forget it. When the Office of Economic, there was a priest in Denver that took some OEO money, and he provided free breakfast at one high school and a similar high school, no breakfast. And the same thing in two similar elementary schools. And he had a year, just 1 year of this. But there were dramatic changes in attendance, in marks, and what have you. So he came to Washington, and I don't know how he did it, but he somehow got to one of the four people on the domestic staff compared to whatever it is, 180 today. And he had a little book. He had just a book. It was like a scrapbook. And I thought, wow. And I fortuitously was having dinner with President Johnson that night, and I mentioned to him because I was so struck by it, and I showed him the book. And he said, oh, my God. He said, we have to have a school breakfast program. That's what we have to do. Now, nobody would take that risk today.
Yeah.
I mean, we do 5 studies. We just, and we have a school breakfast program, and it survived. Yes, go ahead.
Hey, good evening, sir. Thank you for being here and for your presentation. My question is just very simply, where do you see things headed? A lot of people are predicting gloom and doom and autocracy, all that kind of thing. Is it as bleak as? Probably it's not as bleak as that, but is it tilting in that direction? Do you see it as?
I think there's
like
constant
a personality
reaction.
Mm-hmm.
I think we'll see what happens in the midterm elections. I think we have to get better people into the government, and I think we have to. Incidentally, I should have mentioned we really have to. A stronger Congress will put some heat to trim the size of the White House staff. I mean, just have to think about it. There are so many empty assistant secretaryships across the government, but it's irrelevant to the president because he doesn't care about them. These issues are being handled in the White House. I mean, when Bill Clinton wanted to put a health care proposal together, HHS had nothing to do with it. 100 people were brought to the White House staff to put that program together. So we have to stop demoralizing. And believe me, I think people get demoralized. I'm an optimist. I'm a half full guy. I really believe so. Our people get to see more, and they'll react. They'll move the needle back. I think that's inevitable. That's how our country works, and it will work that way. I don't know what happens in specific elections, but I know that there's the battles. Just think about now how important the vote is in all these congressional districts. I mean, that's critical. I think we need to. I think I worry a lot about the Senate because in the last 20 years, the Senate has been only 1 or 2 votes, 3 votes on one side or the other. So the concept of the founding fathers, that you'd have a debate and you'd have, Daniel Webster or Hubert Humphrey or Everett Dirksen on the floor, and they'd have time to think about it, it's nonsense. It's just like the House. Every 2 years, the leadership is up for grabs. So the day after the election, I'm sure Schumer went to work to try and figure out how he could get control, and you have McConnell, fighting to keep. I think this partisanship and the closeness in the Senate back and forth has really changed the Senate dramatically. That and the fact that so many House members are there. Yes, you get the last question. You're the youngest person here. Well, my mother was a teacher for 42 years in Brooklyn, and I don't think she ever would have carried a gun. We never had one in the house. I don't think that's, to me, that's not the way to deal with the problem. I mean, if you're worried about security, just security, it's not that some crazy person is not going to come to the school if they think he might enter a classroom where the teacher has a gun. I think that's nonsense. I think, you can make the schools safer. You don't have to put guns. You can have, we have schools in some very tough neighborhoods in New York. And where you have to go through detectives like you do in the airport. I mean, I'm not suggesting that for all schools, but I certainly think that father that says, let's make the schools safe, let's focus on that. I'm not for guns in schools. I don't know whether you were ready to bear arms. I doubt it. But I know that's not what we want to see. I want to thank you all. I've enjoyed being here. Bradley, thank you.